He was chained because of his skin, crushed because of his belief, but what came from his mouth in a broken empire? This is not just a story of faith. This is the rise of the slave, who became the voice of heaven. Subscribe now for Untold Islamic history in a way you've never heard before. A cinematic journey through the lives of those who shook the world by standing still. The heat was not just in the air, it was in the soul, in the body, in the bruises. It pressed against the skin like a punishment from the sky, and under that Meccan sun, Bilal ibn Rabah lay in silence, his back scorched, his lips cracked, and his breath shallow. But he didn't scream. He didn't beg. He didn't curse the lash or plead for water. The same people who beat him began to fear him, not because of what he said, but because of what he refused to say. Mecca was a monument of voices, loud merchants, poets, tribal chiefs, all wielding their pride like blades. But here was a man with no tribe, no lineage, no wealth, born into the shackles of slavery, marked by the darkness of his skin in a city that worshipped status. And yet, in his refusal to break, he became louder than all of them. They chained. His arms crushed his chest beneath heated stones, and when he wouldn't cry out, they tried harder. Every strike of the whip echoed across the sand, but with each one that fell, his silence grew more dangerous. Bilal was no stranger to pain. He was an Abyssinian in a society that saw his culture as foreign and his soul as cheap. He was a slave, born to a woman who had no protection, sold to a man who had no mercy. His world was a chain, his sky was a ceiling. And yet, when the call to monotheism began to seep quietly through the back alleys and secret gatherings of Mecca, something inside him stirred. Something that had been waiting, buried beneath the dust of humiliation. It wasn't philosophy that moved him. It wasn't politics. It wasn't rebellion. It was truth. Raw, simple, and eternal. One God, Ahad. It made sense in a way nothing else had. So when he stood before his master and whispered, "I believe in the God of Muhammad," the man who had owned his body understood what he had just lost. For the first time, Bilal was no longer ownable. His punishment began the moment he refused to renounce his belief. Umayyah ibn Khalaf, the man who once spoke of honor, dragged Bilal through the streets like animal bait, tying ropes to his limbs and letting children mock him as he was dragged across the hot stones of the valley. But even worse than the dragging were the pauses, when they would stop outside the Qurayshi gatherings and press burning metal to his ribs, asking again, "Do you still believe?" And Bilal, barely breathing, would rasp, "Ahad. They found this more infuriating than defiance. Defiance could be punished, but this quiet devotion, they had no weapon for it, because Bilal was not fighting them with hands. He was fighting them with total surrender to something they couldn't understand. He had been beaten so severely that the very crowd that mocked him now began speaking about him in fear. Someone whispered, "They're killing him." And another replied, "He's already more alive than we are." Onlookers who once walked by slaves without glancing back were now unable to look away. Bilal wasn't just surviving. He was winning a war no one could see, and that terrified Mecca. They tried more pain, more heat. They tied boulders over his chest midday, boulders that crushed and only allowed shallow gasps. Even still, Ahad. In his exhaustion, it became an echo, as if his soul sang it even when his mouth couldn't move. But the city wasn't just hearing his words. They were hearing their own dead gods fall piece by piece. And one man was listening with a broken heart, Abu Bakr, a wealthy merchant, close friend of the Prophet, and one who recognized dignity when the world tried to bury it. He saw Bilal writhing in silence under the sun and could not take another hour of watching Mecca try to strangle truth in broad daylight. Abu Bakr went straight to Umayyah and said, "How much? I want to buy him." Umayyah laughed. You want to pay for that? He's finished. Abu Bakr answered, and I would pay 10 times more if that's what it takes. The deal was done. Bilal, barely conscious, was lifted from the stones not as a slave, but as a man purchased for the sake of God. They carried him from the sight of his torment. But make no mistake, Bilal did not leave Mecca cracked. He left it dangerous. Because they had tried everything, and he had won with one word. They had tried to silence him with cruelty and failed. They bruised his ribs, broke his skin, but they couldn't touch the one part of him that screamed louder in invisibility: his soul. The day Bilal was freed, Mecca lost control over the one thing it never truly understood: a man with nothing to lose and everything still anchored in faith. When he was brought to safety under Abu Bakr's protection, the wounds on his back had not yet healed, but something else inside him had begun to rise. Dignity. A kind of internal straightening that years of bondage had stooped. He didn't ask, "What now?" He didn't demand recognition. He simply sat in silence, clutching water, raspy breath steadying, eyes open as if he was looking at something no one else could see. And perhaps he was. Because for the first time since he'd been born, the weight of the world was falling away, and he was finally standing within his soul, not just his shadow. Mecca still burned around them with its idols and tribal hierarchies, but Bilal had stepped into a different world entirely, not one of violence, not even of revenge, but of divine defiance. He had nothing, but he had said Ahad, and it echoed louder than the Qurayshi banners. The Prophet was told of his suffering, and when they finally met face to face, the messenger, whose heart was forged from mercy and justice, gazed at Bilal, not like a stranger, nor a mere convert, but as family. Neither man said much at first. They didn't need to. One had called, the other had answered. The Prophet placed his blessed hand on Bilal's shoulder and simply said what only one man on earth could say with that kind of meaning. There is no one more beloved to Allah than the one who stands upon truth with nothing but his name. And Bilal, in that moment, knew his chains had been a gift. Now free, Bilal didn't fade into the background. He stayed near the Prophet, absorbing everything, silent but attentive. He memorized the Quran even though Arabic was not his native tongue. He sat through lessons, learned rulings, observed strategies and sirah and suluk. In private, he still bled, but in his heart, he was building. And slowly, others began to notice. Within the growing community of believers, he didn't clamor for position. He didn't argue about who was first. But among the senior companions, Bilal began to represent something they all quietly admired, but rarely embodied so deeply: submission, without bitterness. He was not loud, but when he did speak, even Umar used to stop and listen, saying later in gatherings, "Bilal's voice breaks what our words fail to reach." That voice. It was impossible to forget, not because it was eloquent, but because it had carried pain and still chose to recite peace. So when the very concept of Adhan was revealed, the call to prayer, and the Prophet looked across the sea of believers considering who should make the first call, it wasn't a debate. He looked straight at Bilal. No one questioned it, because everyone knew that Adhan needed not just a strong voice, it needed a voice that had already survived rejection. When Bilal climbed the rooftop and called mankind to their first communal salah, it wasn't religion, it was resurrection. He was calling the world not from a position of power, but from the wounds of a survivor. Mecca heard his voice again, but this time echoing across the rooftops, reaching the Qurayshi lords who once tied him to stones. That voice had once whispered Ahad under crushing heat. Now it shouted Allahu Akbar under the open sky. And it shattered every idol left in the hearts of men. The same city that once dragged him across rock and flame now stood still every time his voice rose. The pain he once buried under sun-scorched silence had somehow become the voice of divine remembrance. And no matter where Bilal stood, on rooftops, battle camps, or beside the Prophet, it was no longer his past they heard in his voice, but his purpose. He wasn't just announcing prayer anymore, he was announcing a revolution in identity. A man once branded by chains was now calling kings, slaves, generals, and merchants with the same phrase, "Come to success, come back to God." And he did it 5 times a day, from dawn to dusk, each call ringing louder in the spiritual ears of those who once dismissed him. But the transformation didn't end with freedom. It only began there. What made Bilal the spiritual conqueror wasn't just that he overcame torture. It was that he used every piece of that pain as fuel to elevate others. He had every excuse to become hardened, bitter, broken. But instead his soul grew brighter. When other companions disagreed or felt moments of pride, Bilal would remind them with his silence. His presence in gatherings was proof of what Islam came to do. Not just save souls, but to rebuild human worth from the ashes of humiliation. The Prophet once heard companions mock Bilal playfully, calling him son of a black woman, and he rose in indignation. "You are still stained by Jahiliyyah," he said. Even the most righteous companions were reminded that Bilal was not to be looked at through the lens of his history, but through the lens of his allegiance to Allah. That is what the Prophet saw in him, and that is what he made sure the world saw too. Bilal knew that his voice was his sword, but he never used it with arrogance. He was never tempted to lead with his story, to ask to be remembered, to own the role of being the Muezzin of the Prophet, like a badge. Even though everyone already knew. Even though the Prophet once said, "I heard the sound of Bilal's footsteps in paradise ahead of me." He didn't speak of that. It wasn't about himself. It was about responsibility. Because Bilal knew that when you are entrusted with a voice that calls souls to eternity, you have to be the first to walk in the direction you call others to. And that is what made him powerful. Not his survival, but his service. Not his scars, but how he wielded them as reminders of what faith costs and how it transforms. To this day, his name is summoned in Friday khutbahs and documentaries, but more importantly, his voice still lives in the Adhan. Every echo from every minaret is traced back to him. Every whisper of Allahu Akbar, riding the winds toward Jannah, began with the lips of a man who once lay forgotten and bleeding in Mecca's streets. That's why he was never just a freed slave. He was a walking miracle. A proof that in Islam the lowest sounding voice in society might just be the first sound heard in paradise. The first time the word pierced the air, it didn't echo. It cracked. It broke the silence in a way no sword could. There wasn't a crowd cheering, no stage, no drums of war. Just a dark-skinned man, his back torn open, rocks pressing into his ribs, throat dry, lips bloodied. And yet from those lips came Ahad. One word, one name, one truth. Mecca had heard chanting before. It had heard poets and war cries and tribal songs. But this was not a performance. This was defiance wrapped in worship. Umayyah ibn Khalaf raised his hand again, struck again. "Say something else," he roared. But from the dirt, Bilal only whispered, then roared louder, "Ahad! Ahad!" And that moment became more dangerous than any rebellion. Quraysh didn't understand it. A man with nothing, no sword, no tribe, no wealth, was rattling the pillars of their gods with a single syllable. Men who could recite entire lines of blood-soaked heritage were suddenly nervous because a battered slave refused to speak what they commanded. They tried pain. They tried spectacle. They dragged him across the valley. Children watched, some laughed. Others walked away in silence, confused, not by his suffering but by his strength. "Why won't he break?" one of them asked. No one could answer, not even Umayyah, who had beaten slaves into obedience before. This one was different. This one had already found something. And once a man meets truth, you can't shame him back into darkness. Ahad was more than theology. It was resistance. Before Bilal, monotheism in Mecca was a slow whisper, quiet conversations hidden in caravan rooms and mountain shadows. But now, it was a scream drawn through chains, shaking the confidence of those whose authority depended on fear. Abu Jahl called meetings about it. He said if this was allowed to continue, it would inspire others. He doesn't even fight back, and yet we look weak before him. Because Mecca was a pride society. To lose to a warrior was noble, but to be defeated by a slave's silence, that was unbearable. Bilal wasn't opposing them, he was exposing them. He made their gods look powerless beneath one word. While they polished their idols with perfume, he lay in the dirt and breathed Ahad. That one word now echoed in corners Quraysh couldn't reach. Men whispered it behind curtains. Wives wept, hearing it spoken by their children. Slaves quietly repeated it under their breath at night. A movement was forming, not of swords or slogans, but of meaning stronger than fear. Bilal had become a threat without touching a weapon, and that made him the most dangerous man in Mecca. No riot followed him, but hearts did. Some say Abu Bakr heard the shout of Ahad from a distance days before he realized who it was. But once he saw the figure beneath the stone, his heart cracked. This wasn't someone resisting for attention. This was someone dying. Beneath principle, he approached Umayyah, furious. "How long will you beat this man before you realize your chains don't reach his heart?" Umayyah laughed. "Take him if he means that much to you." Abu Bakr emptied his wealth. Every coin, every dinar, every piece of gold. He didn't negotiate. He just wanted him free. That moment wasn't financial, it was historic. One of the greatest traders of Quraysh buying a heartbeat that would one day become the voice of Islam. When Bilal finally stood up, wobbly, scarred and silent, the people expected rage, revenge, retaliation. But Bilal didn't even look back. He walked with Abu Bakr, barely able to stand, but carrying something that weighed more than all their punishments. Peace. He wasn't escaping. He wasn't running. He was rising. The ones who tried to crush him became silent at his back. Because a man who escapes with dignity terrifies those who only rule with violence. Later, when people would ask him why he didn't scream, why he didn't curse, why he didn't beg for it to end, Bilal would only shrug and say, "Because his name was on my tongue," and there was nothing else left to say. For most people, freedom came when the chains were broken. But for Bilal ibn Rabah, freedom came the moment he said Ahad, because he stopped belonging to this world. He had seen death, felt it in his lungs, in the weight of stone crushing his chest, but didn't fear it. He feared nothing now except returning to ignorance. That kind of freedom, born in fire, nurtured in silence and raised by truth, was unshakable. And Quraysh knew it. Behind closed doors, their greatest concern wasn't swords or armies. It was stories like his. Because stories cannot be executed once they've taken root in hearts. As Bilal walked through the alleys of Mecca after his emancipation, people stared in disbelief. Not because they pitied him, but because he still held his head higher than the ones who claimed to own him just days ago. When he passed by the idols of Quraysh, he didn't spit on them or mock them. He just walked calmly. The same voice that once trembled in pain now carried unprecedented aura. And though he had no house of his own, no family name to boast, his name had begun to slip into awestruck whispers, even among those who once saw him as invisible. This wasn't a conquest of land. This was a conquest of perception. Bilal's existence became rebellious poetry in Mecca's rigid societal structure. He was a black man in a racist society, a former slave among elite tribes, a foreign tongue in a bloodline-obsessed town, and yet who had God himself raised in most of the Qurayshi hearts. Bilal, the man of only one word and only one Lord. The Prophet would often smile when Bilal drew near. Even years later, he would refer to Bilal with a gentleness that exposed massive love. Bilal is our master, who was emancipated by our master, Abu Bakr. It was said that no man besides Abu Bakr received as much personal attention from the Prophet in private as Bilal did. It wasn't favoritism, it was resonance. Because the Prophet understood silence too. He understood being hated for belief. Their pain wasn't the same, but their patience was. And from that patience, the Prophet gave Bilal space to grow into what no one saw coming, the voice of truth itself. Still, Bilal never sought status. When the companions advised Prophet to make Bilal an official leader, he humbly refused. "I have received more than I deserve," he'd say. He wasn't interested in council seats or leadership over armies. He had served his mission the day he held on to Tawheed when no one else thought he'd even come out alive. Everything else was a blessing, but never a goal. He trusted Allah with the rest. His real victory had already come, not when the chains were broken, but when Ahad had broken the fear within him. That one word became a firebrand on the conscience of Quraysh, and a torch for those still enslaved in soul. For the rest of his life, even after Islam had spread, even after Mecca opened to the truth, even after seeing people embrace Islam in crowds, Bilal remained the quiet roar behind the movement. He still walked with simplicity, still ate modestly, and still cried when the Prophet looked at him, not because of devotion, but because he could still hear the man who told him he was free, even after death. Ahad, once said in pain, now lived in echoes across the peninsula, and its first voice was Bilal's. In the quiet palm groves of Medina, something changed in Bilal. He had entered the city as a freed man, but not yet as a known one. He was quiet, observant, never rushing forward, never speaking unless he knew the weight of his words. And yet, everyone who saw him sensed something. He was not a companion of luxury, nor from a famous clan, yet he walked beside the Prophet with the grace of a man who had already faced death and come out calmer. No one had to say it. Bilal carried something sacred. He had survived Mecca not just by escaping it, but by offering it his soul and walking away with freedom in return. Here in Medina, among believers who embraced him not through obligation, but out of love, his story began again. This time not as a slave, but as the emerging voice of an empire not yet born. The Prophet treated him with an unusual tenderness. Other companions noticed it, but never questioned it. Bilal was always close, at the masjid, on journeys, beside the Prophet during conversations, battles, decisions. But his closeness wasn't driven by politics. It was driven by presence. He made himself available, helpful, gracious. And as Islam began to spread in Medina like light uncovering new corners, the Prophet was tasked with organizing community life, not just spiritually, but socially. People now needed structure, messages, directions, a call toward the prayer that would anchor their hours, something to remind them of God more often than their own desires. This new need gave rise to one of the most beautiful moments in Islamic history, the birth of the Adhan. Several companions suggested a physical signal, bells like the Christians or horns like the Jews. Some recommended a flag, but none of these carried the weight of Islam's uniqueness. The Prophet leaned toward the wisdom of dreaming men, companions who had each seen visions in their sleep, visions of a man calling others to prayer with the power of his voice. When this dream was confirmed in multiple accounts, the Prophet smiled. This is revelation. And just like that, the words of Adhan were composed, sentences that would soon become the most repeated sound on earth. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. But who would carry them? The question circled only briefly before the answer was felt, not just heard. The Prophet looked toward Bilal, and the moment he did, every companion understood. No names were debated, no objections were raised. A man, whose voice had once only cried out, "Ahad" under torture, was now being commanded to call out the name of Allah 5 times a day for the entire Ummah. A man who once echoed monotheism into the dust was now gifted with the crescent-curved song of divine direction. It wasn't just an honor, it was poetic justice. Why him? Why not one of Quraysh's golden-tongued poets? Why not someone whose voice resounded across hilltops naturally? Because our voice in Arab culture wasn't just about sound, it was power. In pre-Islamic Arabia, poetic warfare was real. Verses could incite battles or end them. The most revered men weren't always warriors, they were poets, orators, speakers. And in giving Bilal the Adhan, the Prophet didn't just choose his voice. He gave all oppressed souls the permission to rise in public sound. Bilal's call wasn't simply an announcement, it was a coronation through language. Where once his skin had been used as a reason to chain him, now his voice was the rope pulling all hearts toward Salah. It was early morning. The streets of Medina were still quiet, the air crisp, the date palms catching soft light between their leaves. People were waking slowly, unaware that today their world would sound different forever. Bilal stood atop an elevated structure. Some say it was the roof of the masjid, others say it was a nearby wall. His feet were steady, but his heart, though it had been through battle, beat differently this morning. This wasn't pain, this was purpose. Around him, silence waited like an audience just moments before curtain rise. And then he raised his hands beside his face, closed his eyes, and began the world's first Adhan. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. God is the greatest. Not man, not idols, not lineage, not kings, but God. As the words flew from his mouth, something ancient embedded in the city began to melt. One by one, believers froze, shopkeepers stopped, children paused their play. Doors slowly opened, because something had just split the air, not like a scream or a poem, but like a summons from heaven. The voice was familiar, so familiar that it made some eyes well up before they even fully processed the words. That voice, the one that once whispered Ahad under stone, was now summoning them to stand in straight rows, clean hearts, and prayer. Muhammad listened from the masjid courtyard, his eyes lifted. His gaze was not fixed on the structure, but on Bilal and the sky behind him. Some companions wept, not because they were sad, but because something deeper than pride had just happened. Mecca's lowest voice had become Islam's highest call. This wasn't just a prayer notification. It was a spiritual revolution. Religion had flipped the pyramid, and the sound of it poured across the city 5 times a day. The first Adhan wasn't just heard, it was felt. You didn't have to be a believer yet to understand something had changed. Even enemies of Islam later recounted, "We knew from that call that we were no longer the same town, because the man who was making it wasn't Arab. He wasn't from the noble tribes. He had no lands to pass down. And yet his voice now held more authority than Qurayshi leaders in their own councils." Every single day after that, Bilal called the Adhan, no one else. Not when he was sick, not when it rained, not after battle. It was his right, his honor, his echo across history. The Prophet never replaced him. And though others had voices louder, smoother, more traditionally beautiful, none had the resonance of pain turned into power. Sometime later, the Prophet once commented to Bilal, "Tell me, what deed of yours do you hold to most?" Bilal replied, "Every time I break my wudu, I renew it quickly and pray 2 rak'ahs for Allah." And the Prophet smiled and said, "That is how I heard your footsteps ahead of me in paradise." Even then, Bilal didn't boast. He only lowered his gaze and whispered thanks to the one who took a man chained to earth and allowed his steps to precede prophethood in eternity's garden. That was Bilal. His rise wasn't political, it was spiritual. He didn't conquer thrones. He conquered souls. And more than anything, he conquered the very thing that once tried to break him. The voice that once cried alone in a valley now carried the Ummah wherever it went. When Bilal called the Adhan, the world stilled. Not just the people in the streets or the traders in their stalls, not just the men assembling for war or the children racing through date groves, but everything. Even the sky seemed to pause. Some companions used to say, when Bilal called, the Adhan during battle, you could feel the angels stand still, listening. And perhaps it wasn't metaphor. Perhaps it was the spiritual weight of his voice, rising not just through air, but slicing through the noise of the dunya like a sacred blade. On mountain ridges, in torn tents, on the edge of muddy battle plains, Bilal would rise. Not as a commander, not as a champion of war, but as a voice sent to remind the souls of warriors that their true victory was not here. It wasn't in conquered land or surviving arrows. It was in surrendering to Allah. That was Bilal's battlefield, not the front line, but the front of the heart. He stood above the chaos and became the Ummah's spiritual general. They say there are men who lead with the sword, whose presence brings fear to the enemy. And then there are those who lead without drawing anything, but whose voice reaches further than any banner. Bilal was the second. He didn't wield steel for intimidation, but his voice made hearts tremble, both within and without the army. When the Prophet prepared for battle, Bilal was often the first to raise his voice. And the moment the call rang out, Allahu Akbar, men would weep, dropping their worldly fear and standing straighter. It was a signal not just that war was near, but that higher accountability had arrived, that Allah was watching. Some recalled that tremor in their chest when hearing Bilal start the Adhan before battle was stronger than the tremor of horses charging toward them. Because one reminded you of mortality, and the other reminded you of divine purpose. His voice carried two things at once, fear and peace. Fear of failing Allah, peace in knowing you were still within His grasp. That tension, the spiritual overstimulation of standing between a sword and a sajda, was Bilal's specialty. And even the Prophet used to stand in awe of it. In more than one expedition, when the army camped at night before conflict, it was Bilal who would guard the prayer, give the call, and stand in prayer after everyone else had retreated into their tents. His alerts were not just to start salah, they were to wake the hearts of those who had carried grief, anxiety, or anger into the battle. When others shouted, he whispered. When others collapsed, he was still standing in tahajjud. He led no formations. He wore no rank, but somehow every time he called the believers to rise, they felt like Allah had already written victory on the page. Not political victory, but personal. The kind that outlives bloodshed. Those who stood beside him in the quiet pre-dawn before battles would later say there was something divine in the way Bilal's breath steadying before Adhan could silence an army. Not in fear, but in reverence. Dust would hang in the air, spears buried to rest in sand, horses counting rhythm with their hooves, hearts pounding with doubt, hope, and memory. And it would always be his voice that cut through it first. Steady, rising, absolute. Allahu Akbar, not just a phrase. But the vibration of tawakkul made real, the sound of certainty before the swords even clashed. Bilal didn't speak of war tactics. He didn't need to instruct men about victory and loss. He reminded them of akhirah before dunya demanded anything. And knowing he was behind them, knowing his voice lifted the very air they breathed, that changed everything for a soldier who might otherwise fall to his knees in the shadow of fear. At the height of these moments, especially during campaigns, like Badr or Uhud, there would be eyes watching him from within the Muslim ranks, loving, leaning, learning. Even the Prophet would gaze upon Bilal with a softness that only comes when you're listening to someone turn pain into power. Bilal became more than the caller. He was the reminder. He was the heartbeat at the edge of chaos. When war drew, lines and people forgot why they had come. Bilal's words would realign them. That was his brilliance. He didn't argue for his place. He earned it with every breath that brought people back to Allah. And it wasn't only the Muslims who heard him. Behind enemy lines, the Quraysh feared the moment they heard his voice rise. Some claimed it caused confusion in their ranks. Others mocked it, but quieted faster every time it filled the air. Because that voice reminded them, you couldn't silence him in Mecca, and now he speaks for thousands. They'd tried whips, torture, slavery, shame, and failed. And now the message he once whispered beneath cracked ribs was being sewn into the sky. That's how he became part of the battlefield without wielding a sword. He wasn't in the kill count. He was in the heart count. How many did he save from spiritual collapse in the moments fear gnawed at courage? More than a blade ever could. He never rushed to the front line, but his presence filled its rear with certainty. He didn't lead armies. He led intentions. And when battles were over, it was his Adhan many soldiers waited for before they could cry or break or rest. It wasn't over until Bilal reminded them it was time to return to Allah again. When men bled out slowly after battle, many died with his voice still in their ears, the last thing they would hear before answering the final call. And what better final sound than the one that first woke your soul? Over time, Bilal's position was never contested. They could elect leaders, generals, caliphs, but there was no replacement for the man who called the first Adhan. There was a sanctity in his selection that didn't need to be revisited, and the people respected it. He wasn't just chosen once, he was chosen every day after by the believers, who leaned their hearts closer the moment his voice lifted through the air. He had once been a slave that couldn't speak freely, and yet now, there wasn't a soul in Medina who spoke louder through silence than Bilal ibn Rabah. And even today, though centuries have wrapped the world in noise, his voice still lives in every Adhan. Not in tone, but in testimony. From the top of each minaret, across valleys into cities, over waves and through war, every time the Muezzin says Allahu Akbar, the echo remembers him, and the sky once again listens. The sun still rose over Medina, but that day the light felt empty. The streets were the same, but the air carried a stillness no one could name. It wasn't just the passing of a man, it was the silence that followed. The Prophet had left this world, and in the heart of that city, among the grieving companions, one figure stood frozen, unable to lift his voice: Bilal ibn Rabah, the Muezzin of Islam, the voice of the Ummah, the man who had once shouted Allahu Akbar above the rooftops. Of Medina, louder than the drums of war, could not speak. He didn't cry the way others cried. He didn't collapse. He didn't shout in protest. Instead, something inside him simply stopped, because it wasn't just the messenger he had lost. He had lost the entire reason his voice ever rose at all. There was no public announcement, no formal resignation, just silence. Bilal never called the Adhan again after the Prophet's funeral, because when he reached the part in the call that said, Ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah, his chest would tighten, his breath would shake, and his voice would crack into sobs. He tried. He wanted to for the Ummah, but the sound of the Prophet's name without his presence, it shattered him. The companions would eventually stop asking. They understood. Because this wasn't about refusing duty. This was about a wound, too deep to speak through. He had called men to Salah when the Prophet walked toward him. How could he call when that face would never appear again? Medina became too loud in its memories. Every street corner, every prayer spot, every palm tree in the Prophet's masjid reminded Bilal of moments, of smiles, of walks, of words so soft that only someone who sat beside the messenger would remember them. One day, waking before Fajr. Bilal stood up to perform wudu as he always did. No one was there to notice. But as he poured water onto his hands, he suddenly paused. The Prophet wasn't sitting by the wall today. The Prophet would never be sitting there again. Bilal put the water down and sat in silence, and he stayed seated until the Adhan was already over, without him. The companions didn't pressure him, but they noticed. People no longer waited to hear those perfect notes echo through the air. Now it was different voices, kind voices, sincere voices, but none carried the power of decades of wounds, of early Islam baked into tone and breath. His voice had become a memory too heavy to relive. Eventually, Bilal made a decision. He would leave Medina, not because he rejected it, but because it was too full of everything he could no longer touch, too full of the Prophet's sandals, his patterns on the masjid floor, his laugh echoing from the minbar. Bilal could no longer breathe in a place where his heart walked as a ghost, and so quietly, with his head bowed, not in shame but in sorrow, he left the city that once shaped him, searching now for a place that could let him grieve. He traveled to Sham, what we now call Greater Syria, and settled quietly among the early Muslim communities there. He didn't arrive with titles, he didn't announce who he was, but word always found its way. The Muezzin of the Prophet is here. Entire towns would hush when they saw him walking through the streets, his steps heavy with reverence. Children were told to lower their voices. Young men would quietly follow behind him, hoping to catch a word, a dua, a single moment of wisdom. But Bilal didn't speak much, and rarely, almost never, did he raise his voice in the same way. They had all hoped. No Adhan. Not even a practice call, because his voice had only ever belonged to one listener. And that listener was gone. His life in Sham was simple. Work, prayer, reflection. They say sometimes he would forget meals, distracted by his own memory. People would ask him for stories. Tell us about the messenger, they'd say. But he would just smile softly. Not because he was unwilling, but because speaking made him cry. And crying reminded him that every moment he spent in this world was now simply a wait. A wait to be called again, not by a muezzin but by his Lord. One day, years after the Prophet had passed, Bilal received visitors from Medina. Among them, younger figures from the prophetic household. Some say it was Hassan and Hussein, grandsons of the messenger, and they made a request no heart could refuse. Uncle, they said, give the Adhan one more time. For us. For our grandfather. Bilal wept before even answering. He tried to say no, explaining his heart didn't have the strength, but when they insisted, with eyes that reminded him of the messenger, he finally agreed. The news spread faster than fire through the people of Sham. The streets emptied, windows opened, elders held onto doors with trembling arms. What does it sound like, the voice of Bilal after all these years? He stepped forward to the place where the call would be made, just like before. Head raised, hands lifted, lips moving. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. And for a moment, just one long sacred moment, it was as if the Prophet was alive again. People gasped. Tears fell. Some companions collapsed. They could not contain it. When he reached the line, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, he broke. Voice cracked, shoulders trembled. He couldn't continue. The weight of that name, too holy, too personal, too real, it crumbled him, but he didn't need to finish. Because across the city square, from rooftops, markets, homes, sword hilts and tear-streaked eyes, everyone was already weeping. They weren't just crying because they missed the Prophet. They were crying because hearing that call again reminded them who had made this deen feel alive. After that day, Bilal never gave another Adhan. He returned to his quiet home, his quiet nights, his quiet tasbih in the darkness. Because now he had given the Ummah its last moment of true memory, a final echo of prophethood, a voice that had once been whipped and broken, now cracked once more, not by stone, but by love too deep to bear. He began to fall ill not long after. And when his time finally came, even then his soul remembered its direction. His wife wept as she saw his last breaths near, and she cried out, "What a tragedy!" But Bilal opened his eyes and smiled, and with a voice perhaps no longer strong but still sure, he whispered, "No, what a joy! Tomorrow I meet Muhammad and his companions." Years had passed since Medina last heard the call that once stitched its sky back together 5 times a day. The city had grown, the masjid had expanded, the faces had changed, but in the soul of Medina, silence still lived where Bilal's voice used to soar. It wasn't that the Adhan had stopped, no. Faithful voices continued to rise, but something had left with him. The companions knew it. The earth beneath the Prophet's masjid knew it. And perhaps even the angels who once paused at sound of his calls knew it too. But now, after all these years, Bilal was returning. His body carried the weight of age, but his presence, the air around him, was enough to make grown men straighten, their backs in reverence. Word began to spread through Medina like wind through soft curtains. Bilal is back. Old companions embraced him. Children who had only heard stories of his Adhan followed him through the streets in awe. For some, seeing Bilal again was like time folding in half, like the past walking beside them. He didn't speak of his pain. He didn't explain why he left. He simply smiled gently, his eyes scanning the blessed familiar landscape of a city that never left his heart, even if he had left it. Among those who welcomed him were the Prophet's grandsons, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein. They had known Bilal since childhood, knew the softness in his tone, the lace of pain behind his jokes, and the way his eyes always seemed fixed on something higher than the horizon, and they made a request, one that froze the breath of those nearby. "Uncle Bilal, will you call the Adhan again, just once more, just for Medina?" The request was innocent in its wording, but thunderous in its meaning. He hesitated, his head lowered slightly, fingers trembling gently at his side. Memories clawed their way to the surface. The Prophet's smile when he listened, the nod before every call, the feeling of being seen not as a slave, but as the soul who summoned the world toward truth. Years had passed since he last said those words publicly, since he last called from rooftops and valleys and battlegrounds and dawns soaked in surrender. But how could he say no to the children of the Prophet, eyes that looked so much like his, hearts that had been hugged by his arms? With a heavy chest and trembling legs, Bilal agreed. The morning air carried with it that familiar silence, the kind that came before revelation, before change, before something eternal. As Bilal stepped toward the masjid once more, every breath in the city hung in place. The people had gathered, not by command, not through call, but by instinct, because even those who hadn't heard him before had grown up with stories of the voice that once woke Medina and softened the Prophet's eyes. The minbar stood in the same position. The walls still leaned on each other the same way. But now, for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, Bilal would climb again. His steps were slow, knees a little stiffer with time, but each movement carried more power than 10 armies. As he rose, the volumes of gathered hearts seemed to rise with him, breath by breath, step by step. Some companions couldn't bear to watch, because the last time they saw him there, the Prophet had been alive. Bilal reached the top, lifted his hands, and then it began. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. The sound wasn't perfect, it wasn't smooth. Time had weathered his muscles, dried his chest, but the echo of truth returned to Medina like a storm wrapped in roses. The first few words fell gently across the rooftops. Women began to cry behind their veils. Children looked up toward their fathers, confused by the tears in their eyes. Even Umar ibn al-Khattab, the giant of justice, the one who didn't weep easily in public, could no longer contain it. His shoulders trembled, his hands covered his face, because they weren't just hearing Bilal, They were hearing the Prophet, again, across time. When Bilal reached Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, the weeping became uncontrollable. The masjid was no longer a space of walls. It became the echo chamber of Jannah's memory. In that moment, it didn't feel like the Prophet was gone. It felt like he had never left, and yet Bilal could not complete it. His voice cracked, his breath caught, his body froze. He placed a hand over his mouth and let the tears fall. But he had given what the city needed. The crowd wept, not out of sorrow, but out of overwhelming longing. They remembered. Every person that day went home with a piece of that memory, and that was the last time Bilal ever gave the Adhan, because he didn't need to do it again. That one call stitched the Ummah's wounds back together, not with notes, not with poetry, but with presence. People would say it for decades. We thought we buried the Prophet until we heard Bilal again. There are deaths that shake the world violently, loud, sudden, unavoidable. Then there are deaths like Bilal ibn Rabah's, quiet, slow, and soaked in remembrance. Not loud like a lion's roar, but deep like a river's retreat, returning to its source. In his final days, Bilal did not cry from fear. He smiled more often than usual, spoke even less. His beard had whitened. His limbs had grown lighter. Some days he looked as though he was already partway gone. His body sitting with people, but his soul somewhere further, waiting beneath the shade of palms the world couldn't see. He still prayed, still whispered Allah's name, as if each breath was one more brick toward his palace in Jannah. And for those who visited him, they didn't leave with sadness. They left with awe, as if watching a man already being greeted on the other side. His du'as never stopped. Those who sat near him would sometimes hear his lips moving even in sleep. His eyes opened softly at night, not with confusion, but direction. He would wake from brief rest and begin saying, La ilaha illallah, as if it was his heartbeat. There are reports, though few and gentle, that Bilal once whispered, "It was never my voice that people heard. It was his mercy carrying it." And in that one line he summarized a life's worth of worship. Even his final illness was quiet. No dramatic cries, no sudden collapse, just the slow dimming of a fire that had already lit the skies long enough. He never asked to be remembered, never warned people of his death, because men like Bilal don't fear being forgotten, because their echoes live longer than their names ever could. One morning, his wife sat beside him, watching him fade faster than before. His breathing slowed, his vision blurred. She wept, not from fear, but unbearable love. And she murmured, "Oh no, a tragedy this is." But Bilal opened his eyes one last time and smiled faintly with cracked lips. And he whispered the sentence that has melted hearts across centuries. "No, what a joy. Tomorrow, I will meet Muhammad and his companions." That was his last sentence, not sorrow, not regret, but reunion. His soul, tired from years of silence, of memory, of savor, of longing, finally let go. The day he passed, the town didn't erupt in mourning. It inhaled, slowly, deeply, as if the earth itself understood that this was not just the death of a man, it was the quiet setting of a sun that had lit an entire generation's spiritual sky. There were no horns, no military honors, no royal funeral rites, just people, men, women, children, gathering not to wail but to thank Allah for having once shared time under the same sky as Bilal ibn Rabah. Some kissed the earth near his grave. Others dropped tears into the soil, and many just stood, remembering the voice that had once awakened Medina, the rhythm in his Adhan, the way Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah used to fall from his lips like rain on thirsty hearts. And now, it was still, but not silenced. They buried him softly in Damascus, where his home had been in the final chapters of his life. No marble tomb, no towering shrine, just a simple grave surrounded by fluttering hearts. But soon, that earth would become sacred ground. Over the centuries, his grave became a place where the defeated left their guilt, where the desperate brought their du'as, and where the learned bowed not with books in hand, but with emotion. Generals stood beside it and lowered their heads. Scholars wept quietly, and the common believer whispered, "The voice that called Muhammad to prayer rests here." His tomb was not guarded by soldiers, but by the tears of the Ummah. And those tears, those memories, they were not rooted in what he had gained, but in what he had given. Bilal never conquered any land, but he conquered something more permanent: hearts. He never rode into a city with banners and flags. He simply walked into the ears of people with dhikr so strong they couldn't forget it even if they tried. Every generation after him heard the Adhan not just as a call, but as an inheritance. An echo so soaked into its originator's story that every time it rises, it brings his name back with it. In Indonesia, in Cairo, in Istanbul and Chicago and Kashmir and Cape Town, the moment the Muezzin says Allahu Akbar somewhere, someone recalls Bilal was the first. And perhaps that is why, even without armies or ink, Bilal became legend. Not in fairy tales, not in romance, but in the spaces that matter more than history: hearts, du'as, and voices that still tremble on rooftops in cities he never visited. He was once mocked as a slave, but now generations call him the chosen caller. Not by chain, but by the will of Allah. That, in the end, is the only status that lasts.